She had promised herself no one would ever know who she used to be. She sat quietly in seat 14C, hidden among strangers. Then both engines failed, and the plane began falling from the sky. Minutes later, fighter jets flying beside them asked one question over the radio: "What is your call sign?" Her answer shocked everyone listening. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe for more amazing stories. Captain Daniel Reyes had flown this route many times before. Denver to Chicago was an easy flight, only 2 hours in the air, and the weather that morning was clear and calm. He was 52 years old and had spent 29 years flying passenger planes. He knew every switch, every sound, every small vibration of his aircraft. Nothing about this Tuesday morning felt unusual to him. His first officer, Priya Nair, was younger, only 34, but sharp and careful. She had been flying with Daniel for almost a year, and they trusted each other completely. Together they checked the fuel, the weather report, and the flight plan. Everything looked normal. The plane, a Boeing 737, was full. 162 passengers were on board that day, heading to Chicago for work, for family visits, for vacations, for reasons only they knew. Among those passengers was a woman named Grace Whitfield. She boarded quietly, wearing a simple gray jacket and carrying a small brown bag. She did not talk to anyone. She took her seat, 14C, near the middle of the plane, and pulled out a worn notebook. She wrote a few lines, then closed it and looked out the window. Nobody around her paid attention. The man beside her was busy on his laptop. The woman across the aisle was scrolling through her phone. Grace Whitfield was, to everyone on that plane, just another passenger. But Grace was not just another passenger. 10 years earlier, she had flown fighter jets for the United States Navy. She had served 3 tours overseas, flown more than 100 combat missions, and once brought back a badly damaged aircraft after enemy fire hit both of her engines. Her call sign among other pilots had been Nightingale, a name given to her because she always found a way to bring her aircraft home safely, no matter how bad the damage was. After leaving the military, she had stepped away from flying completely. She worked now as a quiet engineer at a small aerospace company, far from cameras, far from attention, far from the life she once had. She liked it that way. She did not want to be recognized. She wanted, more than anything, to stay hidden. The flight took off at 8:15 in the morning under a clear blue sky. The first 30 minutes were calm. Passengers relaxed. Some slept, some read, some talked quietly with the people next to them. Grace looked out at the clouds below and allowed herself, for a moment, to remember the feeling of flying. She missed it more than she liked to admit. At 8:47, everything changed. A loud bang came from the right side of the aircraft, followed by a sharp shake that rattled the entire cabin. Passengers gasped. Some screamed. The plane tilted. In the cockpit, Daniel Reyes felt his heart drop. "Engine 2 just failed," he said, scanning the instruments. Priya was already running through the emergency checklist, her hands moving fast but steady. "Confirmed, engine 2 shut down. Fire warning light is on." Daniel radioed air traffic control immediately. "Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is Flight 741. We have lost engine 2 and are requesting immediate vectors to the nearest airport." The controller responded quickly, giving them a heading toward a regional airport nearly 60 miles away. Daniel adjusted course, trying to keep the plane steady on one engine. For a moment, it seemed like the situation, though serious, was under control. A plane can fly on one engine. Pilots train for this exact scenario many times in simulators. But then, only 2 minutes later, the second engine began losing power as well. The temperature gauge for engine 1 climbed rapidly, and a second warning light appeared. "Engine 1 is losing power too," Priya said, her voice tight. "We might be looking at a dual-engine failure." Daniel tried every restart procedure he knew. Nothing worked. Within another minute, engine 1 shut down completely. The cabin went eerily quiet, the usual roar of engines replaced by only the sound of wind rushing past the plane. They were now gliding, 31,000 feet above the ground, with no engines at all. Daniel keyed his radio again. "Mayday, mayday. We have dual engine failure. Both engines are out. We are gliding and need the nearest possible landing location immediately." The controller's voice came back, clearly shaken. "Copy that, Flight 741. Stand by, we are calculating your options." Inside the cockpit, Daniel and Priya worked through the numbers. Using standard glide calculations, they figured they had enough altitude to travel about 40 miles before reaching the ground. The nearest airport was 52 miles away. The math did not favor them. Even in the best case, they would fall short by more than 10 miles, likely coming down in a heavily wooded area with no clear landing space. In the cabin, passengers were beginning to understand that something was very wrong. Flight attendants moved quickly through the aisles, instructing everyone to fasten seat belts and follow safety procedures. Some people cried. Some called loved ones. Grace Whitfield sat still, her hands calm on her lap, but her mind was working exactly the way it used to work in the cockpit of a fighter jet during a crisis. She listened to the engine sounds, or rather, the lack of them. She watched the angle of the plane. She understood, faster than most passengers around her, exactly what kind of trouble they were in. She thought about staying in her seat. She had left that life behind for a reason. She did not want anyone to know who she used to be. For a long moment, old memories came back to her, the sound of alarms in a damaged cockpit, the weight of a control stick that no longer responded the way it should, the years of training that taught her to stay calm when everything around her was falling apart. She remembered how it had felt to lose the career she loved, how painful it had been to walk away from flying and build a quiet, ordinary life where nobody asked questions. Coming forward now meant giving up the only thing she had left, her privacy. Once people knew who she really was, she could never go back to being just another passenger again. But she also remembered why she had become a pilot in the first place. It was never about medals or attention. It was about protecting people who could not protect themselves. She looked around the cabin one more time. She saw a teenage boy gripping the armrest with white knuckles. She saw an old man quietly praying with his eyes closed. She saw the young mother holding her child even tighter now, whispering that everything would be fine, even though her voice was shaking. Grace understood, in that moment, that her fear of being recognized meant nothing compared to the lives sitting around her. Staying silent to protect her privacy was no longer a choice she could make in good conscience. She took a slow breath, the same breath she used to take before every difficult mission, and made her decision. She unbuckled her seatbelt and stood up. A flight attendant hurried toward her. "Ma'am, please sit down, we need everyone seated." "I used to fly fighter jets for the Navy," Grace said quietly but firmly. "I have experience with total engine failure and emergency landings. I need to speak to the pilots right now. It could save this flight." The flight attendant hesitated only for a second before leading her toward the cockpit door. She knocked using the emergency signal, and Priya opened the door, confused to see a passenger standing there. "This woman says she has military flying experience," the flight attendant explained quickly. "She wants to help." Daniel turned, frustration and disbelief on his face. "We don't have time for this. We are in the middle of an emergency." "Sir," Grace said calmly, "I flew combat missions for 10 years. I have brought back an aircraft with both engines damaged before. I know how to manage a glide using terrain and wind. Please, just give me 30 seconds. Something about her voice, steady and completely without panic, made Daniel pause. He looked at his instruments again, at the numbers that told him they would crash short of the runway no matter what he did with standard procedure. He had nothing left to lose by listening. "Talk fast," he said. Grace stepped closer and looked at the navigation screen. She saw the mountains ahead of them and the wind direction shown on the display. "The wind is coming from the west at almost 30 knots, she said. "If you fly along the ridge line of those hills to our left, the wind hitting the slope will push upward. It creates rising air along the whole ridge. It will slow your descent rate. I have used this exact technique to stretch a damaged aircraft's range before. It will not give you extra engines, but it can give you extra distance." Priya looked at Daniel. "It's worth trying. We don't have another option that gets us to a runway." Daniel nodded slowly. "All right. Take the jump seat. Talk me through it." Grace sat in the small fold-down seat behind the pilots and fastened the harness. She began speaking in short, clear instructions. "Reduce your speed to 200 knots, no faster. Turn to a heading of 285 degrees. Keep the ridge on our left at a steady distance." Daniel followed her instructions exactly. The plane turned toward the hills. For a tense minute, nothing seemed to change. Then, slowly, the descent rate began to slow down. What had been a drop of over 1,000 feet per minute became 600, then 400. The invisible column of rising air along the hillside was doing exactly what Grace had said it would. "It's working," Priya said, almost in disbelief. "Descent rate is dropping." Outside, 2 military fighter jets that had been sent to observe the emergency arrived alongside the passenger plane. Their pilots watched in amazement as the large aircraft glided steadily along the ridge line, clearly being flown with skill beyond normal airline training. One of the fighter pilots, a man with the call sign Falcon, radioed in. "Flight 741, this is Falcon. Confirm, who is providing guidance in your cockpit? That flying is not standard airline procedure." Grace hesitated before answering, but there was no more reason to hide. She took the radio. "Falcon, this is Grace Whitfield, former Navy pilot. Call sign Nightingale." There was a pause on the radio, then Falcon's voice returned, filled with shock. "Nightingale? Confirm your call sign." "Confirmed, Falcon. Nightingale." "I flew with pilots who trained under you," Falcon said. "They still talk about the landing you made after that strike in the desert. If you are giving instructions in that cockpit, they are in good hands. I will let ground control know." With the extra distance gained from the ridge lift, Grace calculated that a small regional airstrip, closer than the original airport, was now within reach. She guided Daniel through the approach, telling him exactly when to lower the landing gear, when to extend the flaps, and how to manage the plane's speed with no engine power to help him. The final minutes were tense. The runway came into view, cracked and narrow, clearly not built for large passenger jets, but long enough if the landing was precise. Grace spoke steadily the entire time. "Hold your speed. Do not go below 150 knots until we cross the threshold. Then ease it down gently." Daniel guided the plane lower, following every word. The wheels touched the runway firmly but safely. He immediately applied maximum brakes and raised the spoilers to slow the aircraft as fast as possible. The plane shook and rattled as it rushed down the short runway, but slowly, the speed dropped. With only a short stretch of runway left, the aircraft finally came to a complete stop. For a moment, there was silence. Then the cabin erupted in cries of relief, tears, and prayers of thanks. Daniel let out a long breath and turned to look at Grace. "You just saved every person on this plane," he said quietly. "I don't know how to thank you." "You flew it," Grace said. "I only told you where the air would help you." For several seconds after the plane stopped, nobody moved. Passengers sat frozen, still holding on to armrests and to each other, as if they could not fully believe the shaking had ended. Then, slowly, the fear turned into relief. A woman near the back began sobbing quietly, thanking someone on the phone that she was alive. A father pulled his 2 children close and kissed their heads, his hands still trembling. Strangers who had never spoken to each other during the flight now reached across the aisle to hold hands or pat shoulders, united by what they had just survived together. Flight attendants moved quickly but calmly, checking on passengers row by row, helping those who were shaken stand up, and preparing the cabin for evacuation. The emergency slides were deployed at the front and rear doors, and passengers began climbing down one by one, many of them crying, some laughing with disbelief, a few simply silent, still trying to process what had happened high above the clouds. Emergency vehicles arrived within minutes. All 162 passengers were evacuated safely, with only a few minor injuries from the hard landing. Investigators later found that both engines had been damaged by a rare batch of contaminated fuel loaded that morning, a mistake traced back to a fueling error at the departure airport. It was not an attack, only human error, but the result could have been just as deadly without Grace's intervention. News of the landing spread quickly. Reporters wanted to know who the mysterious woman in seat 14C really was. Grace tried at first to avoid the attention, but her story eventually came out. She had left military flying after being passed over for a promotion she deserved, following a disagreement with a senior officer about safety procedures she believed were being ignored. She had never spoken about it publicly before. Now, with cameras finally listening, she did. "I did not plan to say anything that day," she told one reporter. "I just wanted to keep to myself. But when I saw how frightened everyone was, I understood that hiding was no longer the right choice. Sometimes you have to step forward, even if you would rather stay unseen." Her old squadron reached out to her within days. The aviation community, moved by her story, pushed for her contributions to be properly recognized. Months later, she was invited to train new pilots in emergency procedures, teaching the same techniques that had saved Flight 741. She accepted, not because she wanted attention, but because she understood that her knowledge could now help others avoid disaster. Daniel Reyes retired the following year, but he often told people that flying with Grace Whitfield for those 15 minutes taught him more about real skill and calm judgment than his entire career combined. Priya Nair kept flying and later became a captain herself, always remembering the lesson that expertise can come from the most unexpected person in the cabin. As for Grace, she never fully returned to the spotlight. She preferred a quiet life, teaching young pilots and working on aircraft safety improvements. But every year, on the day of the emergency landing, she received messages from strangers who had been on that flight, thanking her for a life she had allowed them to keep living. She kept every message. She never forgot that she was supposed to stay hidden, until the moment the world needed her most.